Welcome back, and good evening. A bit of a departure from the standard fare for this episode. As you may or may not know, I am a composer. Sometimes this is a technical role, but it's also a creative role as well. And as much as I don't want this to be a music channel, I think I do want this to be a creative channel. A place where we can feed, nurture, and let bloom our imaginations as part of how we exercise our minds. A key part of that nebulous thing we call art is a suspension of our disbelief, which is so contrary to the way we often think. Tonight, we aim to infuse ourselves with the beliefs, traditions, and qualities of the supernatural, essentially to pretend for a time. So with that in mind, let us speculate, perhaps wildly, and tell spooky tales around the campfire. Let our imaginations play tricks on us. Just a little romantic license to make the evening more convincing, more conductive to the spirits that surely do surround us. Before we begin, however, I'd like to note that just recently, on the 20th of October, we lost the great magician, skeptic, educator, author, and charlatan James Randi. May he rest in peace. Part 1. Magic. Magic is everywhere in human culture. Historically speaking, it was said to exist out there in the world, but it manifests as an organizing ability within certain individuals. Thus, we have the idea that certain people use magic, implying that it's already out there somewhere. It might be said that when a magician speaks magic words, they are a command. They are speaking to magic. This is similar to how witches were thought to channel the devil, not that they controlled the devil, or the way shamans and witch doctors act as a conduit between one realm and the next. While the invention of magic is most definitely human, its frame of reference is seen to be outside of our realm. It's not ours. It exists as a primal and natural force. It's important to keep in mind what magic actually is, which is not something we often think about. There's a tendency to believe that the people who practice such things, especially during the olden days, whatever that means, were ill-informed or stupid, or that the philosophies surrounding their views were not sophisticated. That's not really accurate for many reasons, but in this case there's one really big reason, and that is reason itself. Magic exists in an adjacent realm to us. It is a refusal to explain how something works or why something acts the way that it does. It's not that we don't know how it works. Knowing has nothing to do with it. Reason simply has no place here. In his paper, The Identity of the History of Ideas, philosopher John Donne writes something that I think is pertinent here when he talks about reason and its limitations. There must be a point in any argument at which a man stops being able to give reasons, like the demand to give general reasons for the practice of self-preservation. Such a request, while it is intelligible enough to some, must simply seem a category mistake to most people. Believers in magic often point this out. Demanding to know how magic works is like asking a priest what came before God. The question doesn't make sense, and nor shall the answer. Magic is the point in the conversation with a child where you can only repeat that one irritating answer. It just is. It's magic. However, this becomes more difficult to dismiss as it becomes more specific to us and more active in our lives. Part 2. Religion and Spirituality. Whether you believe in a specific deity, many, nothing, or don't know what you believe, it's undeniable that religion has been around for a very long time and continues to play a pivotal role in the society we live in today. For this video, we're going to assume the God of Abraham because it's more likely to be appropriate for my audience and for me. Most religious doctrines interact directly with people. They are, in a sense, about or because of humanity. In the Christian worldview, there was no religion on earth prior to us. Before God created humanity, there was no one for religion to apply to. Religion is anthropocentric, in that it is a set of rituals and beliefs that surround humanity in a frame of reference that necessarily includes us. It may relate back to a deity, but regardless of whether God was here before humanity, religion was certainly not. A common argument against religion is that its claims are unfalsifiable. i.e. you cannot begin to show that its claims are false because of things like moving goalposts or dismissive deflections such as God works in mysterious ways, which essentially renders the whole conversation null and void. This objection to religious reason is valid, certainly, but claiming that all these belief systems are about is truth is rather missing the point. At their heart, belief systems reflect a new perspective of the world that, while it may have no obvious effect on reality, is still a different description of the world we live in than one that does not include the supernatural. Religion and magic are often considered to be the same, but as we can see, they come from different places. One is part of us, and the other one surrounds us. They are also regularly depicted as opposing forces, with miracles and divine intervention providing the strict and disciplined counterpoint to wild and untamed magic. We are going to talk more about religion and magic, but first, there is another supernatural belief that is very tightly interwoven with both of these ideas that we need to address first. Part 3. Death and the Undead. Death is dear to us. There's something fascinating about the metaphysical way humanity views the end of life, and the exacting way that various cultures have catalogued it. I think the reason for this is that death is the quintessential concern at the heart of the human condition. It transcends culture and ties us together, because by its presence it begs to be addressed. There's only so long you can ignore death. It's worth noting that other markedly intelligent species have considerable recognition of death, and even rituals surrounding it. This is especially important because it shows that death is not anthropocentric. Death is interesting because when we consider it, we must embrace certainty, at the same time as giving way to all-consuming doubt. We don't know when it will happen to us, or what happens after, but we all know that it is coming. And unlike religion, which is about us, and magic, which is around us, death happens to us. In a sense, it is in us and predetermined. We have no choice in the matter. Except for Keith Richards, who is eternal. How many stories include death as the defining moment between failure and success? Even if someone doesn't die now, it doesn't mean they won't. It just means not today. Even then, you don't see many stories that end with, "And they all staved off the inevitable shackles of death for yet another day." So with all that in mind, what, if anything, happens when we die? And when did it start happening? 2,000 years ago? 100,000 years ago? 1,000,000? One of the most common beliefs about what happens to us when we die is that we rise again, maybe as a corpse or malicious creature or a spectre. It's not often considered when we talk about the undead, but heaven and hell also meet the criteria for undeath. Heaven and hell are indeed both described as life after death. Surely those people are the reanimated dead, they're just not here on earth. These beliefs about why the undead rise are connected to our insecurities about life. People return because they were killed unjustly, or because they were evil or cruel in life and never atoned for their sins, or just otherwise because they did not find the peace needed to find eternal rest. Loose ends, basically. This is illustrated in the book Encyclopaedia of the Undead by Bob Curran, where he details the role of religion and the church when it comes to the undead. Curran writes that around 500 AD, a story starts to appear around Europe of Bishop Germanus of Auxerre. He and his entourage were forced to take refuge in a haunted hovel while travelling. As they were preparing to camp, a ghost approached them and hurled rocks at them, only stopping when the bishop invoked the name of God, at which he ceased, became humble, and told the bishop that he had been buried without proper rites. The bishop ordered a new grave dug, exhumed and reburied the corpse, and blessed the hovel, freeing the spirit. In this tale, the church showed its power over the unquiet dead. In fact, subsequent Christian folklore concerning the dead now increasingly emphasize the triumph of the forces of virtue over wandering cadavers. Another story tells of King Robert the Bruce. Upon his visit to a local lord, the lord captured a poacher and sentenced him to death, but Robert pardoned the man. When Robert left, however, the poacher was rearrested and executed against the king's wishes. The region was henceforth haunted by a revenant that drank blood and spread plague in its wake. This story is important not because the man's death was unjust, indeed this was a fitting punishment for poaching at the time. Instead, it is significant because kings were considered to be appointed by divine right, and as such, disobedience was against God's will. These tales show that the church considered that undeath was a natural force, but one that acted in the absence of the will of God. In other religions, such as those followed by the ancient Egyptians, undeath is a recurring and explicit theme in the religion itself. In one fable, Osiris is slain and dismembered by his brother Seth, and eventually reformed by Isis and Nephthys, giving him new life. While Osiris is not considered undead per se, he is the god of life, the dead, resurrection, and the afterlife. That sure sounds like a religion that has a preoccupation with the undead to me. One more note before we move on. Vampires are the most fascinating undead creatures that I know of, and they hold a unique place in history, and in particular in pop culture. They really deserve a whole episode on their own, which I may make someday. For now, however, consider this passage from the book The Ethos of History, Time and Responsibility, by Claudia Linden and Hans Ruin. The vampire is a creature that respects neither the boundary between life and death, nor conventional historical chronology. Its refusal to die is also a refusal to allow itself to be localized and confined within a given temporal order. The vampire is someone who returns, who moves across and through time, and who thereby visualizes a past that does not rest peacefully in its grave, but intrudes upon the present in order to simultaneously attract, threaten, and exploit it for its own continued existence. I think that's a really cool description, and I'd like to delve deeper, but another time. Part 4. Lovecraft. We've talked about historical tales of religion, magic, and the undead, but you can't really talk about stories without also talking about fiction. One of the most recent and prominent writers of supernatural fiction is Howard Philip Lovecraft. Lovecraft was mainly considered a horror writer who borrowed many of his ideas from the arcane traditions of our own world. He also details the beliefs of obscure cultures, that sense of over there in the far reaches of the globe in that weird or exotic country, in which Australia is included, by the way. Lovecraft speaks through journal entries, records in asylum papers, shipping manifests, and captain's logs. Recounts of weird encounters which we could almost have read ourselves in a dusty tome sort of tucked away at the back of your grandfather's desk. And again, like magic and unlike religion, in his world, Lovecraft does not control his horror, he merely channels it. In Encyclopaedia of the Undead, Bob Curran writes that Lovecraft's stories are described so meticulously that commentators have often wondered if there were not some factual basis to them. Was Lovecraft privy to some corpus of arcane and horrendous knowledge, to which the rest of us remain mercifully oblivious? Does his work contain germs of truth, masquerading as fiction? This idea is reinforced by running themes in his work of anxiety, nightmares, degenerate bloodlines, and madness, all of which Lovecraft believed he was inflicted with. Lovecraft continues to stretch the traditions of Alexander Poe, who is undoubtedly his primary influence, in that he speaks through the minds of real, admittedly troubled, but ordinary people who have experienced extraordinary things. H.P. Lovecraft's stories necessarily contain a seed of self-doubt, as any of ours would were we to write about that thing we swear we saw once in the shadows, which we don't say we experienced, because it would make us sound, well, mad. As Lovecraft himself says, the abnormal always excites aversion, distrust, and fear. The fact that Lovecraft writes of a world which is essentially our own grounds his stories and gives them real gravitas. The main distinction between a Lovecraftian universe and ours is as follows. I am able to say of horrifying things that they are the stuff of nightmares and that they do not exist. In a Lovecraftian world, the protagonist is able to say that their world is the stuff of nightmares, and they do not know what exists. This is sometimes literal. The distinction between dream states and conscious states in Lovecraft's world is deliberately blurred. Sometimes the only thing separating the illusion from reality is that the character never wakes up. Lovecraft turns the day into the night, where you can only see so far, and a fleeting shadow or a queer call becomes anything and everything of which you cannot conceive. So on occasion, when the mood strikes you, or perhaps on a night as sable and wicked as All Hallows' Eve, you might allow yourself the luxury to believe that the dead stalk their weary way amongst us once more. It sure makes for a more entertaining evening than rumours of tyranny, deceit, and plague. These tales are fictional, and we know that, but they have a very real impact on our culture and our reality, and they borrow from stories that have very real significance, such as that of the Bishop or Robert the Bruce. But those events didn't really happen, right? It doesn't seem odd when we recount a tale of something that we saw that was vague or mysterious, a shadow or a voice between the walls, but we would find it very doubtful that a bishop communed with the dead, or that a disobedient lord brought a revenant upon his people. These tales are portrayed as reality, but we don't really believe in the truth of them. If no one ever believed in the truth of them, though, how did these tales propagate? Part 5. Truth. The obvious answer is that once these tales were believed to be true. A more important question to ask, however, is why they were believed. French philosopher Michel Foucault says, "Truth is a thing of this world. It exists only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint," and that the idea of something being able to be true depends on our episteme, a group of accepted but unconscious rules of knowledge, or that which makes knowledge worthy of consideration. Epistemae belong not just to certain peoples and regions, but also to time. They slowly change every year, every day, every second. Within the episteme of the time of Robert the Bruce, Undeath was real, true, and worthy of being considered. Sometimes all that takes is for someone to say, "I do not know what is possible." And what is possible is something we fool ourselves into believing we do know all the time. This goes some way to explaining why such stories survived, though to be candid, I have no idea of the method of propagation. If we think about Christianity today through the lens of our own episteme, we still occasionally use religion to illustrate moral teachings, but we very rarely use it as a representation of reality. At some point, as a culture, we did consider the events of the Bible to have taken place, but now we wouldn't dream of it. In a similar way, we avoid drawing moral teachings from scientific fact, for example. Be not mistaken, that is a road well travelled, and many a journey has ended in disaster. During our next episteme, we might not consider these things to be so detached from one another. We are in a time of great change, and what's just around the corner is still very hard to determine. Whether you are religious or not, it would be foolhardy to claim that belief and its subsequent lessons have not affected our reality in a very real way. If religion had no significance and no claim to its own ancient form of truth, if it had no relevance, you might say, then it wouldn't exist anymore. I believe the same goes for magic and for the undead. In a sense, they were true once as well. There are so many definitions of what truth actually is, and like any good debate, the conversation doesn't end. If you believe something and it affects the way you act, does that make it true? Does it matter if it is true, if you continue to act as if it were your entire life? And even if so, why is truth desirable? Philosopher Max Horkheimer says in his book The Eclipse of Reason, which I highly recommend, that, according to pragmatism, truth is to be desired not for its own sake, but insofar as it works best, as it leads us to something that is alien, or at least very different from truth itself, and that, when reason is used to connote a thing or an idea rather than an act, it means that the thing or the idea is good for something else. The philosopher Albert Camus had a very different thing to say about truth and understanding in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, which I also highly recommend. The mind's deepest desire, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. Understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal. Too often we find out far too late that the truth is not only relative but nebulous, and that knowledge is not a maze, it is a labyrinth. As Camus himself notes, there are truths, but no truth. The philosopher Derek Parfit says of personal identity that to be remembered is to survive. We live on in the memories of other people. Part of personal identity is cultural too. Like it or not, we are a reflection of the past. And there exists in our not-too-distant history, in that same cultural memory, a world riddled with things that we now mostly ignore, that helped shape the world that we have inherited. They survive through being remembered by us. Within our current scientific belief of the world, magic, religion, the undead are just myth, but we can still learn from them. We still talk about them, we still write about them, some people worship them. We make stupid shows about them. They still figure so prominently in art and culture and metaphor. I'm not trying to disregard science or argue that fact is invalid, and I remain an atheist. But I think there's more to humanity and to our culture and our past than knowledge. We live in a world where what is regarded as fact and truth, or fiction and falsity, both cause harm and do good, and not one more than the other. I've also learned more about myself, my identity, the world, and my place in it by studying art and fiction and culture more than I ever have from studying fact or science. And I find the view that having an inclination for the numinous is a character flaw both ever more prevalent and deeply disturbing. Dare we one day say that to stare up at the night sky and wonder is to transgress? If you made it this far in the video, thanks for hanging around. As always, I want to leave you something that you can go away and look at, or in this case, listen to. In keeping with the theme of the video, one of my favorite composers, Peter Warlock, was an occultist, often consorting with the likes of W.B. Yeats, and at one point becoming a member of a theosophist circle. That's not his real name, which was Philip Arnold Heseltine. Strangely, the name change came before his interest in the occult, but that may reflect his interest in literature of that kind before he really took it seriously. Anyway, he wrote a fantastic set of dances known as the Capriol suite. I'll link a really good performance of it below. Even if you're not much for classical music, I think this one is particularly accessible and really a lot of fun. Please give it a listen. Another thing to note is that all of H.P. Lovecraft's work is now in the public domain and has been compiled by a very dedicated group of fans. I'll leave a link in the description to that one as well. Happy Halloween, everyone. This year I'm going absolutely nowhere because of coronavirus restrictions, so indulge me one last thing. One of my earliest memories is from the 2000 film Excalibur. I was listening more than watching Arthur and Guinevere's wedding scene. It may not be a very good movie by technical standards, but I value it, and it's part of who I am. It's my own very small glimpse of inherited history, and I think it is important. And I'll never forget what Merlin spoke to Morgana. It's a lonely way, you know, the way of a necromancer. Yes, to know too much. Lacrimae mundi, the tears of the world. The days of our kind are numbered end. The one god comes to drive out the many gods. The spirits of wood and stream grow silent. It's the way of things, yes. It's a time for men and their way.